In 1603, Ieyasu Tokugawa had a problem. And this problem was twofold. Tokugawa had become the first shogun, the first military ruler of Japan. Between about the 1300s and 1603 was known as the Warring States period in Japanese history. They had an emperor, but the emperor didn't have a lot of power. It was effectively run, the country was effectively run by these warring samurai that controlled different areas of the country. And in 1603, Tokugawa became the main shogun who controlled all of Japan. But the problem was, since about the mid-1500s, the Europeans started coming. And they had been taking advantage of the lack of political structure to kind of carve up Japan for their own purposes. The Dutch, the Portuguese, the English. So Tokugawa, the first thing he did as shogun was he kicked out all of these Europeans. And he completely closed Japan off to the rest of the world. The problem was, how do you rule a country when all the citizens have been exposed to these other countries that have vastly superior technology? How do you become an effective leader that the people respect? And this is when Tokugawa came up with what historians think is one of the greatest master strokes of social engineering genius. He came up with the idea that simplicity is an ideal to be pursued. And from this idea that simplicity is an ideal to be pursued comes everything that we would refer to as Japanese culture. For example, the tea ceremony, a very popular thing that Japanese people practice today. It is a very spiritual experience. You spend a lot of time crushing the leaves, steeping the tea, pouring the tea with absolute singularity of focus to maintain the the harmony of the experience. Japanese flower arranging, the same thing. Arrange the flowers, singularity of focus, the colors, the shapes, the harmony of the experience. Japanese martial arts, Japanese Zen Buddhism, meditation, Japanese rock gardens made of sand and rock to maintain the harmony of the situation, to be contemplated with a singularity of focus. The European Dark Ages ended in the 1300s when Muslim traders came through the Straits of Gibraltar and landed in Italy, because Italy back then was not a cohesive empire. It was a collection of city-states. So it was easy for the Muslims to find a safe port, and they brought with them stuff from around the world. They brought with them a lot of Asian goods, Asian spices. They brought texts from ancient Greece to reintroduce Europeans to the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. But more importantly, these Asian goods were extremely popular in Europe. And this set off a competition to see who could easily get these Asian goods and sell them in Europe. Because they were so popular, if you were a kingdom and you managed to get a hold of these Asian goods and sell them in Europe, you could make a lot of money and use that money to hire more soldiers to expand your empire. The problem was twofold. One, nobody really knew how to get to Asia. This is why Columbus did what he did, to try to find the quickest way. Two is that Asians weren't too fond of European goods. So you had to find a way to get to Asia before all your competitors did, and you had to find out a way to get stuff that you could sell to the Asians to get Asian stuff and bring the Asian stuff back and sell it in Europe. And this battle, this competition went on for 500 years. First, the Muslims controlled the sea trade, then the Spanish, then the Portuguese, then the French, finally the British. And the British won this 500-year battle because they were the most vicious. They were straight up gangsters. The first thing they did was they went to Central America and they kidnapped a bunch of Central Americans and forced them to work in the silver mines. Then they would take the silver to China. And at this time, in the early 1800s, the Qing dynasty in China was very, very weak. So the British could just show up and do whatever they wanted, make their own rules. And so they would take the silver, buy Chinese stuff, bring it back to Europe, sell it, make a massive profit, reinvest that into their business, and keep doing that. But then they got greedy. They wanted to keep the silver. And so their next phase, their version 2.0 of their gangster empire, was to go to India and kidnap a bunch of Indians and force them to work in the poppy fields. And they would use the poppy to make opium. They would take the opium to China and sell drugs to the Chinese. And that was much more profitable than using silver. And this lasted the first half of the 1800s until the famous Opium Wars. Meanwhile, in Japan, they knew that they could not maintain their seclusion for very much longer. They knew that the British were coming, that the Americans were coming. They couldn't hide from the world anymore. So they had two options. How do you handle this? One team wanted to just stay hidden and defend yourself at any cost. But by then, the amount of weaponry that the foreigners had compared to what the Japanese had was enormously different. They could not withstand getting assaulted. The other option was that the best defense is a good offense. And the guy in charge of this philosophy was a guy named Ryoma Sakamoto. And he led what is now referred to as the Meiji Restoration, because Emperor Meiji was emperor at the time where they quickly modernized. And they modernized by sending out people all over the world, teachers, professors, philosophers, scientists, engineers, to learn as much as they could from the world and hopefully modernize themselves. So before the British and the Americans came back and tried to carve up Japan, they would be an empire themselves. They deliberately had to build their own empire to keep the wolves from attacking. But the problem was they didn't have a lot of resources. They couldn't sell much to the world because they could barely feed themselves. And probably the most instructive experience that one of these experts had when he was out in the world came from a California winemaker. The Japanese guy that was visiting the California winemaker noticed that they buy cork from Germany. And he said, "I don't understand why you do this. You have trees here. Why can't you just make cork from the trees that you have here?" And the guy explained, when we sell a bottle of wine, we buy the absolute best products from around the world. We grow the grapes here because this is the best soil. We buy the bottles from the best glass makers. We buy the labels from the best artists. And we buy the cork from the best cork makers. And this was a stroke of genius to the Japanese, because that is exactly what they did. Even though they didn't have any natural resources, they applied this idea, this basic economic idea, and within one generation, they became as rich as all the other countries. How did they do that? They imported loom machines from Britain. These steam-driven loom machines that were the driving force of the Industrial Revolution. They imported raw cotton from the southern United States after the Civil War. And they wove raw cotton with these loom machines into fabrics, textiles, that they sold to the world, made a massive profit, and used those profits to modernize their country. One way to measure productivity on a cotton loom is how many cotton looms you can manage at once. The job is essentially to watch them automatically weave the fiber and stop the machine and untangle it when it gets tangled up. So how many loom machines you can manage is a measure of your productivity. The British could handle 8 looms at once. The Americans could handle 8 looms at once. Indians could handle 4 looms at once. But the Japanese could handle 12 looms at once, because they had spent the last 200 years focusing on their simplicity of intention, their intention of focus on this one simple thing at the expense of everything else in their mind. And they used that intensity of focus, which was born out of a weakness, and they turned that into their greatest strength. And that is how Japan became an empire within one generation. The lesson from this story is clear. The world is a scary place. You can hide from the world and hope the world doesn't find you, or you can go out into the world, learn from the world, and apply your focus to what you learn from the world to build your own empire. Thank you.